Over to Les Bergen to talk about Jewish Washington, Scrapbook of an American Community. Welcome.
Good morning, good morning. The Jewish Historical Society put on a major exhibition at the National Building Museum in 2005. A 2007 book shown here on the left that's based on that exhibition is the basis for most of this talk. For 60 years, the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington, we collected and shared stories about the unique nature of Jewish life in our nation's capital, a history that is at once local, national, and international. The Historical Society was recently renamed the Lillian and Albert Small Capital Jewish Museum. So let's first review the history of the Washington area Jewish community, and we'll cover a few decades at a time. And we'll tell you more about this new museum at the end of the presentation. Now, notice that red brick building on the left of the architect's rendering of the new museum. We're going to talk a lot about that little building in a few minutes. So let's start on the history. Isaac Pollock was Washington's first known Jewish resident. He arrived from Savannah in 1795. He was a developer who came to Washington when it was declared the capital city. And by around 1800, he built what's called 6 buildings, which housed several government agencies. Now, these were located on 21st and Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, which is about 4 blocks from the White House. And they were demolished sometime during the 20th century. And now there's a little city park located on here, and this is surrounded by George Washington University. It was the initial home of the State Department and the Secretary of the Navy. And later on, it became the residences for Secretaries of State James Madison and William Seward, and also as a residence for General Sam Houston when he served as a U.S. Senator. Now, there's a general pattern here that we're going to see throughout this presentation all the way into the 21st century. First of all, this was Mr. Pollock's secondary settlement. He was from Savannah. Washington is not a major port city, so it's never been a place of initial settlement or immigration. The project here was either government related or government generated. We'll see that throughout. And the project was important to the city's physical development. Now, in 1828, Army Captain Alfred Mordecai of North Carolina was assigned to the Washington Arsenal, which in a later tour of duty as a major he commanded, and that's now called Fort McNair. His daughter Rosa claimed that she was the first Jewish child ever born in the District of Columbia in 1839. And she wrote that when her infant brother Frank died in 1843, the city lacked a minion or 10 men to say Kaddish at the funeral. So we still had no real Jewish community by the early 1840s. Legal repression following a failed 1848 revolutions all over Central Europe triggered immigration to the United States, including the first true Jewish communities, both in Washington, D.C. and in Alexandria. So here you see Washington Hebrew congregation became the first Jewish congregation in D.C. in 1852. By 1856, it became the only Jewish congregation in the United States with a congressional charter, which is shown on the right side of the screen. and it was signed by President Franklin Pierce. And it says in part that all rights, privileges, and immunities heretofore granted by law to the Christian churches of the city of Washington be, and at the same time are, hereby extended to the Hebrew congregation of said city. By 1863, the congregation was able to purchase, during the war, was able to purchase this former Methodist Episcopal Church, which was located on 8th Street Northwest between H and I streets. And that's one block north of what a century later became the Chinatown section. Now, this building was replaced in 1898. We'll see a photo of its replacement later on. Now, the war created a boom in the Washington, D.C. population, including of Jewish merchants. The Jewish community grew from about 200 people pre-war to about 2,000 during the height of the war. Jewish women organized to nurse wounded soldiers, some of whom settled permanently in the city. Meanwhile, across the river, pro-Confederate Alexandria remained under Union occupation. Now, high security of river crossings made family connections and commerce between these two close Jewish communities quite difficult. Now, the Historical Society published a small book about Jewish life in DC and Alexandria during the nation's largest war, eliminating parts of the liturgy and replacing some of the Hebrew with either German or English, and authorizing a choir and an organ following Protestant activities. Traditionalists broke off to form a new congregation. Now, you recognize this little building. That's that little red brick building attached to the Future Museum that was on the first slide of this, or the second slide of this presentation. It is the original Adas Israel Synagogue in what later became the Chinatown section of DC. Today, it's the oldest surviving building constructed as a synagogue in the metro region. Now, note its simple architecture. And we're going to contrast that with slides I'll show you later on of later synagogues. The building was dedicated in 1876 during the US centennial, and President Ulysses S. Grant sat through the 3-hour dedication service and contributed $10. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it really was a meaningful amount. That's the equivalent of about $200 in today's purchasing power. Now, this building was quickly outgrown, but it was served as a place of worship for 32 years. And it was in 1908, it was replaced. The congregation moved to a new building at 6th and I Streets. Now, here you see the synagogue in its original location at 6th and G Streets Northwest. Nearby, you see right in the next block, the large brick pension building for paying union pensions after the war, which for the last 20 years has been called the National Building Museum. The Chinatown section is about 2 blocks off to the left, and the modern Capital One Arena is off to the bottom right, the next block over from this photo. And you can see in the background the US Capitol building and Library of Congress to give you a feel for where we're located. Now, after 1908, when the congregation moved to a new building, this became the original St. Sophia Greek Orthodox Church for a few years until they built a larger facility. And then for the next half century, into the 1960s, the synagogue served as retail space. Initially, it was C. Mark's bike shop on the ground floor, which had been the mikveh and perhaps admin when it had been a synagogue. By the 1950s and 60s, it was a pork carry-out, a pork barbecue carry-out restaurant catering to the nearby courthouses. And throughout, the main sanctuary on the second floor and the women's gallery up on the third floor were mostly just abandoned, so accidentally preserved. Perhaps that second floor was used for storage, but nothing was changed architecturally. In the late 1960s, plans were made for putting the new metro headquarters on the same block that this synagogue had been on, so it would have demolished the synagogue. And the Jewish Historical Society sprang into action. With help from the local and federal governments, the society moved the building 3 blocks to the corner of 3rd and G Streets, northwest, in December of 1969. The society restored and maintained the synagogue, which is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Now, in this photograph, just off the photo on the left, this whole block on the left here, is the old Pension Building or National Building Museum. And on the right side of this block, the entire block, is the GAO and headquarters of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, the old white building you see in the background, 1 block back, is no longer exists. That's the location of today's, which used to be called the Verizon Center, where the Wizards basketball team and the Caps ice hockey arena are located today. In 1880, there were about 1,500 Jews in DC, so it had come down a little bit from the war years. They were mostly second-generation Americans, German-speaking, mostly non-Zionist, and mostly Reform. 40 years later, in 1920, there were 10,000 Jews in DC. It had gone in that 40 years from 1,500 to 10,000. By 1920, they were mostly immigrants, Yiddish-speaking, who had fled from Tsarist Russia and Poland. Most were Zionist, and many were traditional, Shomer Shabbos. They wouldn't ride on the Sabbath. Now, during this period, there were also several small synagogues, mostly Orthodox, that sprang up all around the city of Washington. Now, the photograph here is from the 1910s of Cantor William and his bride, Jenny Tash, from Russia. Now, note the architecture, quite different from that simple little synagogue we saw earlier. These are DC's 3 oldest congregations, and their synagogues were all located within 3 blocks of each other along I Street Northwest, near where today is the Gallery Place Chinatown Metro Rail station, all within about a block or 2 of that metro station. These buildings served from the late 1890s until the early 1950s as synagogues. After that, they were all replaced with other synagogues, other parts of the city. But the congregations, all 3 of these congregations, are still quite active in the city of Washington. From west to east, or from our photos, from left to right, they're increasingly traditional, as by the late 19th century, the American Jewish community had broken into its 3 major movements. On the left, you see the 1898 Washington Hebrew congregation. This is the building that replaced that 1860s church that the congregation had purchased. In the center, you see the second Adas Israel. This is the building that replaced the little red brick building on our second slide, the one that still exists. This is a much grander Moorish style, um, located at 6th and I Northwest. And on 5th and I, Oev Shalom, the Orthodox synagogue of essentially East European, that this building had been initially a Presbyterian church built in the 1850s, and designed by the same architect who designed the U.S. Capitol building. Today, by the way, it's used as a Chinese community church because this is the Chinatown section. They've put the steeple back up, but they've retained the original facade and the original windows, and the interior is all modern renovation. Meanwhile, across the river in Alexandria, on the left, you see the Bethel Hebrew congregation, which is the oldest congregation in Northern Virginia, starting in 1859. And this building you see here was the first building constructed as a synagogue in the metro area, 5 years before the one that's the oldest surviving one that we showed you earlier, Adas Israel. It was located a short block from the Episcopal Christ Church, which was where George Washington and in a later generation, Robert E. Lee worshiped. And on the right, Agudas Achim congregation, organized in 1914, mostly East European Jews that were uncomfortable with the classical reform of Bethel and of the more settled German Jewish community. And the photo is from 1928 when they purchased this large house. Now, both of these are in what is now called Old Town Alexandria. And after World War II in the 1950s, both of these congregations moved out to West Alexandria and are still quite active in synagogues there. The growth of the federal government during World War I triggered a growth in the DC Jewish community. At the top left, you see Arthur Welch. Now, he was an immigrant from Russia who became nationally known as the first Jewish aviator in the United States. He was the Wright brothers' most trusted test pilot and pilot trainer. World War II commander of the U.S. Army Air Force, 5-star General Hap Arnold, was one of his students. And he said that Art Welch taught me everything I know about flying. Mr. Welch was killed in a test of a new Wright brothers design for the Army in 1912 at the U.S. Army Aviation School, which was then located at College Park, Maryland. On the bottom left, you see a photo from 1912 of the dime messenger service, mostly boys and then young men. And why was it called the dime messenger service? Because they charged 10 cents a message, serving mostly the expanding federal government. And it was owned by, it was woman-owned, which was unusual in early 1900s, by Liz Cresson. On the right, you see Yeomanette, World War I Yeomanette, Jenny Biron at the Washington Navy Yard. She was providing home support while her brothers were on active duty. After World War I, the need for a large Jewish community center in the capital city was evident. So the Jewish Community Center was built on 16th Street, several blocks up the street from the White House, and it opened in 1926. Now here you see a year earlier laying the cornerstone, dedicating the cornerstone, and that's President Calvin Coolidge gave a speech and the Marine Band played. During the interwar years between the 1920s and 40s, the Jewish community dispersed out of that little core Chinatown area into Northwest DC, along Connecticut Avenue, Massachusetts Avenue, New Hampshire Avenue, and 16th Street. And to a lesser extent, they spread all over DC because there were little Jewish shops, merchants all over the city, and families tended to live either above the shop or short walk from their shop. But the Jewish community was almost entirely or predominantly within the District of Columbia and with the small community over in Alexandria. Now, the New Deal and World War II brought major growth to the Jewish community in DC. At the top left, in the 1940s, the wholesale grocery business was about a third Jewish owned, the other 2/3 also from recent immigrant communities, Italians and Greeks. And it was located and still located near Gallaudet University at New York Avenue and Florida Avenue Northeast. Now, Jews at this time owned most of the independent neighborhood grocery stores. The photograph at the top left is in the center is poultry wholesaler Fred Kolker. And on the right, you see Chazan or cantor Moshe Yolson, who is also a shochet or a ritual slaughter for kosher meats. Now, he's most famous because his son was also a singer, Al Jolson. On the top right, you see a photo from 1942 of a Agudas Achim congregation, which was still located in Old Town, loaning its Torah scroll to the United States Marine Corps base at Quantico. And at the bottom, also from 1942, a Passover Seder at the Willard Hotel for over 1,000 soldiers, family, and friends. Now, Washington Jews were confronted with signs like this at popular vacation spots, such as Beverly Beach near Annapolis on the bay. Instead, they frequented Bay Ridge and Tivoli beaches. Department stores such as Woodward and Lothrop did not hire Jews. Jewish physicians were barred from holding office in the Medical Society of Washington. The Spring Valley neighborhood near American University and parts of Chevy Chase had restrictive covenants, and after those were removed, real estate agents actively dissuaded Jews from purchasing homes in those neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the Woodmont and Indian Spring country clubs were open to Jewish families in Montgomery County. Now, these practices eased up after World War II and were essentially gone by the late 1960s. Washington Jews played important roles in supporting restoration of a Jewish state. In 1938, over 4,000 Washingtonians attended a rally to pressure the British government not to restrict Jewish immigration into Palestine. K Jewelry owner Edmund Kaufman and Rabbi Isidore Breslau became national leaders of the Zionist Organization of America. Others met secretly to raise money for ships to bring illegal immigrants from Europe to Palestine and to purchase surplus arms and munitions for the Haganah, the underground militia. Now, the photograph here is when President Truman announced the United States recognition of the Jewish state. A crowd gathered at the Jewish Agency building, which overnight became the Embassy of Israel. Now, the headline for this photograph in the New York Times read, "A new flag is raised on Embassy Row." The embassy back then was located on Massachusetts Avenue, 2 blocks northwest of DuPont Circle. In the late 20th century, it relocated to a secure modern building near University of District of Columbia. Now, you recall that tight concentration of pre-World War I synagogues in the old Chinatown section. After World War II, people didn't like old-fashioned. So notice the modernist architecture of these 1950s synagogues, all located in upper Northwest DC. The Jewish community was moving north after World War II, just starting to settle in Montgomery and Prince George's County, Maryland. However, it was still predominantly in the district, inside the District of Columbia in the early 1950s. Now, founded in 1947 was the Montgomery County Jewish Community, and it was the county's first Jewish congregation. It's in Chevy Chase, just off East-West Highway at Rock Creek, and it served the Chevy Chase and the then new Silver Spring communities. That's a couple, today we know it, its location to get it focused, it's a couple blocks from the Parkway Deli today. MCJC, as it was known, built a synagogue and a community center, including a gym, on land located by real estate developer Sam Eig, E-I-G. In 1952, MCJC hired their first full-time rabbi, and in 1966, changed its name to Or Kodesh Congregation, which is still quite active in that location. Now, many businesses moved to the suburbs to follow their customers, and corner groceries and pharmacies and hardware stores became regional chains. Before the 1940s, there was a Jewish-owned small grocery on almost every residential block in the District of Columbia. Giant Food brought the first self-serve supermarket to the area, started by Nehemiah Cohen and Sam Lehrman. Giant grew into a regional chain with more than 50 stores, including this new one built in 1959 in Bethesda. The chain was sold to a Dutch conglomerate in 1998. Remember the ad? Don't say drugstore, say drug fair. Milton Ellsberg and Robert Gerber started Drug Fair as a pharmacy on Glebe Road in Arlington in 1938, innovating by selling household goods as one passed through the store to reach the pharmacist. By the 1970s, it had expanded to 170 stores. It was about roughly 20 years ago, it was sold to Rite Aid, which is now merged with Walgreens. At the bottom right, you see Sidney Heckinger expanded his original wrecking business and lumberyard into a regional hardware chain, catering to the do-it-yourself homeowners. This Rockville store opened in 1957. Heckinger died a year later, and his son John and son-in-law Richard England ran the family business until it was sold in 1997. Jewish-owned businesses in DC, in central DC, were many destroyed by the riots of 1968 along 7th and 14th Streets Northwest and H Street Northeast. The 1950s to 80s brought additional round of government growth, and with that, large expansion of the Jewish community during that period, predominantly into Prince George's and Montgomery County, Maryland, especially centered on the Silver Spring area in the early part of that period. By the 1960s, the Beltway and interstates accelerated movement out north to Rockville and later to Germantown and south into Fairfax County for the first time. Real estate developers really became sort of the lay leaders of the Jewish community during this period. Most were East Europeans, immigrants who came young to the United States and started out as small-time contractors. Best known as Charles E. Smith, who was a Russian immigrant who moved from New York City to Washington in 1942. Now, he started out building small duplexes, moved up to apartment buildings, and later on, all of Crystal City, right adjacent to National Airport. His son, Robert Smith, and son-in-law, Robert Kogod, expanded the construction and facilities management business. Other names that may be familiar to you are Shannon and Lux, Morris Kafritz, who built, for example, the River House, those large apartment buildings across the highway from the Pentagon, and many K Street office buildings. Albert Small and his son, Albert H. Small, and now grandson, Albert H. Small Jr., with Southern Engineering. They built over 20,000 houses, condos, office buildings throughout the metro region, now predominantly in Northern Virginia, and they built many of the K Street office buildings. Sam Eig built apartment buildings in Tacoma Park, Northwest DC, and along the I-270 corridor. Ted Lerner, Max Ammerman, and the Godelski family built Tyson's Corner, Wheaton Plaza, and Lerner and other partners, White Flint Mall, and Abraham Kay with Kay Construction Company. Arlington National Cemetery became popular for Jewish veterans after the burial of John F. Kennedy in 1963. It now contains over 6,000 Jewish graves that represent a microcosm of American Jewish history. Most were ordinary soldiers or sailors from every major war, from the battles of 1864 in Spotsylvania Courthouse in Petersburg to 2004 in Najaf and Fallujah. Here you see the headstone of Private First Class Bob Cohen, who was from Philadelphia. He was a field artillery forward observer. He was captured at age 22 during the Battle of the Bulge, and he was one of 84 American POWs that were murdered by the Waffen-SS at Malmedy in Belgium. There are several prominent Jewish veterans and spouses buried at the cemetery, such as Justice Arthur Goldberg, Professor Marty Ginsburg, the husband of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Senators Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey and Warren Rudman of New Hampshire, Representatives Allard Lowenstein of New York, and Gladys Noon Spellman from Prince George's County, Maryland, a couple of ambassadors, Dr. Albert Sabin, who cured polio. I know of 4 Holocaust survivors buried there. 3 of them were veterans, and 1 was the wife of a career Army officer. Of those 4, Charlene Schiff and Major Eddie Wilner were from Northern Virginia, and Alan Kiron was from the District of Columbia. The 4th was from Arizona. Admiral Hyman Rickover and 4 other 4-star admirals and 1 4-star Army general are buried here. Several monuments have substantial Jewish connections. The Confederate Memorial, the USS Maine Memorial, and the Korean War Memorial. The Challenger and Columbia Space Shuttle memorials, all with a substantial amount of Jewish connections. I led tours of the cemetery for about a decade, and I can do a presentation on that if people are interested. The Historical Society published a small booklet on the right. The photo is of Rabbi Marvin Bash officiating at the funeral of Colonel Mel Rosen of Falls Church. Colonel Rosen was a West Pointer and a field artillery officer who served at Corregidor and was on the Bataan Death March. He remained on active duty through the Korean War and the Vietnam War. In 1956, the Jewish Community Council, which is now called JCRC, performed the first survey to determine the size and demographics of the Jewish community of the metro area. In 1956, the Virginia side was still mostly in the city of Alexandria, with smaller Jewish settlements in Arlington County and the city of Falls Church. Jewish residences in Fairfax County were too small to even show up as a bar on this chart. Meanwhile, there were meaningful Jewish populations with synagogues in Anacostia, and about 11% of the regional community was in Prince George's County back then. Some major findings out of this 1956 survey. The Jewish population of the metro area had increased to about 80,000, and it was now the 7th largest Jewish community in the United States. The majority of the Jewish community, for the first time, was in the suburbs outside of the District of Columbia. So 1956 is the tipping year. You can see 49.9% still in the district. So this was the first year by chance when they did the survey, it was in the suburbs. And over a third of the Jewish workers in the region were federal employees, no longer merchants as they had been before World War II. Now, the major conclusion of this survey was that the future center of mass of the Jewish community would be in the Rockville area. We have to build for that future. So that was 56. It took several years to plan, pull together money, design, and construct. But by 1969, the Rockville Jewish Community Center complex was dedicated, with Vice President Spiro Agnew, Governor Marvin Mandel, and Justice Arthur Goldberg attending or speaking at the dedication. The photograph is Charles E. Smith on the right at the groundbreaking a couple years before it opened, accompanied by the oldest resident of the Hebrew home and the youngest child in the JCC nursery school. And both those facilities were still in the district when this photo was taken. Now, Smith was the president of the Jewish Community Council during the mid-1960s. So he was a driver on this thing. And as mentioned previously, he was a major developer. So he's the person that found the site strategically located near major roads and new housing developments. Now, how do they finance this thing? Well, Mr. Smith called a meeting of the 100 most affluent Jewish men and women in the community. And about 85 showed up and pledged meaningful gifts to be spread out over 5 years. The 3 buildings were separately funded and each fully paid for and completed within 1 week of each other. Developer Abe Poland worked with the architect and the construction firms to make sure that happened. Now, the original complex was 3 facilities: the Jewish Community Center that replaced the one on 16th Street, the one that was built in the 1920s, which was sold off. It was no longer a Jewish Community Center. The Jewish Social Services Agency and the Hebrew Home, a retirement home, all 3 of which are still active and exist. Other facilities were added later, most notably the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School in the 1970s, and still later the Jewish Federation and JCRC moved into this complex. Back to Virginia, we discussed previously the Bethel Hebrew congregation in Agudas Achim from the 19th and early 20th centuries. And then there was a gap. Nothing much happened on the Virginia side for several decades until the Pentagon was built. And that brought another surge of Jewish population, mostly in Arlington and Alexandria. And that created a need for a new synagogue, which was called Arlington Fairfax, or ARFAX. And in 2002, it changed names. It's now known as Eitz Chaim. And then there was another gap of about 20 years, and the Beltway and other highways brought the community out into Fairfax County. All three of these at the bottom were in Fairfax County, each one a bit further out from the center, city center, further out into the suburbs. Today, there's about 20 congregations and less formal groups that comprise the core of Jewish life in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia Jewish community is centered on synagogues predominantly, along with the Pozez Jewish Community Center, which is sponsoring today's talk, and the Gesher Jewish Day School, both out near Fairfax City. Now, the major growth in the 1980s and more recently has been more in the Northern Virginia side of the river. The top photograph is from 1982, the first year of the Gesher Jewish Day School, which at the time consisted just of these roughly 10 kids in a kindergarten. It was located in a classroom building at a Agudas Achim congregation, which at the time the rabbi was Rabbi Sheldon Elster. He and his wife had a lot to do with organizing Gesher. And the teacher you see sitting there is Mora Susan Koss of Montgomery County. This photograph is what got me initially involved as a volunteer for the Historical Society. The little girl on her elbow here is my daughter Leah. And as a result of seeing this photograph in that 2005 exhibition, I, with some friends, were able to identify all of these children for the archives. These children are all now in their early 40s. The middle photograph, the Jewish Community Center of Northern Virginia, was organized in 1977. And this new building was finished by 1990. And it's located on the edge of Fairfax City towards the Beltway. The bottom photograph is of Rabbi Amy Schwartzman. She's a chief rabbi of Temple Rodef Shalom, which is the largest synagogue, the largest congregation in the Commonwealth. And at the time she was appointed as chief rabbi there, it was the largest congregation in the United States with a female chief rabbi, and she is still the main rabbi at Rodef Shalom. On Sunday, December 6, 1987, was the eve of a Washington, D.C. summit between Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev and President Ronald Reagan. Between 200,000 and 250,000 people rallied on the National Mall in an unprecedented display of solidarity for Soviet Jewry. Speakers included Elie Wiesel and recently released Natan Sharansky and Sleepaks and other refuseniks, Vice President George H.W. Bush, Speaker of the House of Representatives Jim Wright, and the pop folk music group Peter, Paul, and Mary. President Reagan sent a strongly worded letter of support. Now, he used the rally to link freedom for Soviet Jews to trade agreements with the Soviet Union. Synagogue groups from across the Washington area participated. I came with my family, including my preteen children, with the large Agudas Achim complement. Meanwhile, about 100 refuseniks in several Russian cities went on a hunger strike during this conference. Other refuseniks demonstrating in Moscow and Leningrad were beaten and arrested by the KGB for doing the same thing we were doing in freedom here. The Historical Society put on an exhibition and published a small booklet about the Soviet Jewry movement in Washington that you see on the left. Now, in the current century, in 2004, not one but two new synagogues moved out into Loudoun County, Virginia. Sherry Shalom in Leesburg and Beth Haverim in Ashburn. The photograph is showing transporting a Torah scroll to the new synagogue in Leesburg. Sherry Shalom congregants Howard Lurie, Howard Manis, and Rosalind Lurie in a car driven by Jan Shankman. Neat photo. In 1997, the DC JCC, the 1926 JCC, was repurchased and returned at that original 16th Street site. So by now, in the current century, we have 3 JCCs in the metro area, one in Northern Virginia, one in the District of Columbia, and the third one out in Rockville, which is by far the largest. The Edlovich, and the one in DC is now called the Edlovich DC JCC. In 2002, Hillel, the Foundation for Jewish Campus Life, constructed a new international headquarters at 8th and H Street Northwest in the heart of what had been that late 19th and early 20th century Jewish neighborhood, directly adjacent to that second Washington Hebrew congregation building, the synagogue that was built in 1898, and you can see the edge of it here. And in 2003, that second Adas Israel synagogue at 6th and I was repurchased and opened as an event center, including increasingly religious services as Gen X and millennial Jews born in the mid-1970s and later flocked back into the center city. Now, there have been 4 surveys of the Jewish population of DC. The 1956 survey that we talked about earlier, 1983, 2003, and 2017. And to summarize these, in 1956, we spoke earlier, it was the first time that the majority of the Jewish community was tipped out into suburban, outside of DC, into the suburbs, mostly into Montgomery County, shown in blue, and Prince George's County, shown in red. And the Jewish population had grown to about 80,000 people. In 1983, the Jewish population had pretty much doubled to about 160,000. Montgomery County, shown in blue, was by far the dominant center of mass of the Jewish community, with over half of the metro population. And the Montgomery County Jewish community was moving further north out the I-270 corridor. Meanwhile, the DC and Prince George's County Jewish communities had shrunk, and the Virginia suburbs were shown in purple, were starting to show major growth. You can see the difference here. The 2003 survey, the population had blossomed up to about 215,000, and by 2017, almost 300,000. And by now, we were either the 6th or 7th largest Jewish community in the United States, depending on what year you look at. By 2003, Montgomery County was well over half of the Jewish community. And the Virginia suburbs had grown to be in about a third of the community. Mostly by now, by 2003, mostly in Fairfax County. 2017, note the large increase in population in DC, shown in green. This is younger adults, and especially Northern Virginia, which is now becoming quite large. And some of the findings of the 2017 survey, over 40% of the Jews lived in Northern Virginia, which was a shock to everybody on both sides of the river. About a quarter belong to a synagogue, but 86% participate in some kind of Jewish activities, either the synagogue or Jewish Community Center, or maybe the Historical Society or the Genealogy Society, or maybe contributing or volunteering for philanthropic charitable organizations. On the negative side, fewer than 30% of the children are enrolled in a formal Jewish education. Personal opinion, that's a serious problem or concern. That's the history of the Jewish community. That's what we're going to do. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about this new museum. Little did we know this historic synagogue would move again. It's part of a massive Capitol Crossing project, which primarily consists of 6 high-rise buildings under construction on a deck over I-395 after it exits the 3rd Street Tunnel. This new Jewish museum will be a key component in a redeveloped neighborhood of offices, condos, and shops. Ours is a unique synagogue. It relocates every century. As a past president of the Historical Society said, we should have invested in synagogue wheels. The photo is from a year and a half ago, January 2019, when the synagogue was moved a couple blocks to its new and hopefully final home on the corner of 3rd and F Streets Northwest. Here it is at its final location. Now, after this photo was taken, it was turned 90 degrees so that the ark faces east towards Jerusalem, as it did originally in its original 1876 location. The historic synagogue will become the starting point for museum visits. A 2-story lobby will link the synagogue, representing our past, with a new museum of our future. A 2nd-story bridge from the modern museum will make this 2nd-story sanctuary fully accessible. The new 4-story state-of-the-art museum will include 3 public floors with exhibit galleries and a top floor for collection storage and offices. Additional spaces will hold public programs. The core exhibition will be filled with interactive experiences that invite visitors to get hands-on with history and learn together. An interactive map of Jewish Washington sites and events will answer the question, where is Jewish Washington? The Community Action Lab will invite families and student groups to interact with primary sources and objects. Workshop experiences for families and school groups will provide activities that enable a closer examination of primary sources related to Washington Jewish history, Jewish-related arts and activities, and social justice explorations. Now here's our last slide. I've mentioned 4 books published by the former Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington, and you can purchase these for the 3 on the right for $5 each, or the one on the left, which is a coffee table book, originally $35. You can buy it at a closeout price of $10. Plus, no matter how many books you order, a $4 per order shipping and handling. Now, the museum staff is working from home now, so we can't ship the books or sell them until the quarantine is lifted in DC. If you'll notify me at the email at the address at the bottom of this slide, and I'll just put your name on a list and we'll inform you when the books can be sold. Thank you very much. And Sherry, now I'm ready for Q&A.